Emily, what's on your radar this morning?
Well, about a month ago, Apple booted Antonio Garcia-Martinez, author of Chaos Monkeys, after a group of employees circulated a letter claiming to be, quote, profoundly distraught by his hiring. They ripped a few passages from the book out of context to cast him as a misogynist that threatened the company's, quote, culture of inclusion. This is obviously a laughable complaint to type from behind your MacBook nestled into a Tony Silicon Valley office when the salary that pays for your seamless orders is literally built on the backs of forced laborers in China. It makes for an odd definition of inclusion. On his Substack, Matt Taibbi raised a devastating point. Quote, I'm a fan of Dr. Dre's music and have been since the NWA days. It's not any of my business if he wants to make $3 billion selling Beats by Dre to Apple, earning himself a place on the board in the process, Taibbi wrote in May. But if 2,000 Apple employees are going to insist that they feel literally unsafe working alongside a man who wrote a love letter to a woman who towers over him in heels, I'd like to hear their take on serving under and massively profiting from a partnership with the author of such classics as Bitches Ain't Shit and Lyrical Gangbang, who is also the subject of such articles as Here's What's Missing from Straight Outta Compton, Me and the Other Women Dr. Dre Beat Up. He added, it's easy to get someone like Antonio Garcia-Martinez fired. Going after a board member who's reportedly sitting on hundreds of millions in Apple stock is a different matter. A letter making such a demand is likely to be returned to sender, and the writer of it will likely spend every evaluation period looking over his or her shoulder. Why? Because going after Dre would mean forcing the company to denounce one of its more profitable investments. Yeah, so where are the urgent internal letters of concern about Apple suppliers apparently relying on oppressive labor practices? How about Apple raking in billions off Dr. Dre's brand and including him on their board? Why is Antonio Garcia-Martinez less tolerable than Dr. Dre? If the author's hiring helped the company establish standards of inclusion, why has a month gone by with no reports of internal efforts to emotionally demand the company part ways with Dr. Dre? The truth is that neither Dr. Dre nor Garcia-Martinez threatens Apple's, quote, culture of inclusion. But Garcia-Martinez is an easy target for the performative outrage the elite left now uses to shield corporations from serious scrutiny, signal in-group status, and artificially boost their own reputations and their own power. The result is that actual corruption metastasizes in the shadow of these distractions, which should irk our self-appointed champions of social justice who eagerly accept jobs that pay their bills with oligarchical conduct and abhorrent labor practices. They cash those checks and they sleep just fine. So why relitigate this now? Well, a new report in the Daily Mail exposed a bizarre 2019 text exchange Hunter Biden had with his cousin Caroline, who was offering to set him up with her model friends. Quote, domesticated foreigner is fine, no yellow. Hunter, the president of the United States' son, wrote just 2 years ago after Caroline said, quote, I can't give you effing Asian. Just last week, the Daily Mail reported on Hunter's repeated use of the N-word in conversations with his lawyer just 2 years ago as well. It was largely ignored by the legacy media. That would be much more defensible if it weren't obvious to everyone that legacy media would have breathlessly covered any such revelations about a Republican president's son. Journalists would be racing each other to concoct the most creative and virtuous performances of outrage theater. We all know it. Again, that's what happens when the target is easy. When the target is less politically and ideologically convenient, the relative silence is telling. But this is so much deeper than whataboutism. This gets to the utterly bankrupt morals of our sanctimonious establishment. Easy targets make for great shields, allowing them to construct a facade of altruism that falsely soothes their consciences and burnishes their reputations with their peers, who are all engaged in the same superficial nonsense. The result is a self-perpetuating cycle of mediocrity and greed. When it actually counts, the most vocal champions of woke capital just prefer to cash their paychecks. Colin, I think when we see these performative displays of outrage, when it comes to somebody like Antonio Garcia-Martinez, what it reveals when the going gets tough, when the rubber meets the road, and there's not similarly performative outrage, is that it's so it's so, at the end of the day, theatrical. Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what this points out is there's different standards for different people depending on their positioning in society. And that's not how these situations should be treated. Now, I don't know exactly what Antonio Martinez said, but what I can tell you is I think generally in our current environment, we're all just a little too sensitive at times. And I'm certainly not, excusing anyone's use of language that's defamatory or targeted based on race or any other one of the reasons that people get attacked, and there are cultures of inclusion, which I think are a good thing. But you shouldn't just target one employee while ignoring the rest of the problem. And actually enables it to grow and qualifies that it's okay for some and not okay for others. And you either have a standard or you don't. I mean, that's how these things are fundamentally supposed to work. So, are we going to be a culture of inclusion? If so, then let's make Dr. Dre have a statement on this as well, right? And if not, then let's just admit we're not going to. But I'm with you. Let's not play the game of selectively, castigating someone for their actions. Everybody's held to the standard or they're not. It's
amazing to me to think about these Apple employees literally typing out a letter like this from behind their MacBooks while they have their paychecks are made off of the backs of forced laborers. I mean, it is truly amazing to me that they took the time and they, behind their MacBooks, they took the time to write out a letter like this with no sense of self-awareness. And that's the question here to me is how hollow is their moral code if it's applied with these differing standards, right? So I think the different standards are very clear and very obvious. I think that gets to what I was talking about when I say that, one person is an easy target and the other person is a much more difficult target. And when the target is more difficult, the silence is deafening. But what does that say, I think, about the moral code of some of our people who purport to be the most moral and who are the most insistently forcing that morality on everybody else? And that's a dangerous situation because they are legitimizing and normalizing and validating a moral code that is totally bankrupt and empty at the end of the day because it has these incoherent standards.
Yeah, look, I'm with you. I think it really, in some cases, lacks authenticity. And the danger in that is that if we are trying to protect people, protect workspaces from these kind of attacks and discrimination, when you just selectively target people, I think you make it very easy for these arguments to completely fall apart, and then people stop paying attention to them. And that's a dangerous thing because we do want more inclusive environments, but if you're not holding these environments to an authentic standard, you weaken the entirety of the argument. So I'm actually really with you on this. I wish people were a little less sensitive in some regards, and that, there wasn't this tendency to jump up and down all the time at every single thing that somebody says, because again, I think that weakens the argument. But you got to be real about it, or just don't do it at all. That's my opinion.
Well, but and while they're sort of complaining about this, I think they're being used by the executives at their own companies to distract from their own terrible labor practices, and that's what's metastasizing in the background and in the shadow of all of these conflicts. That's what's actually happening. So they don't realize how counterproductive it is. They don't realize how counterproductive their strange, totally incoherent moral code is to actually helping victims of oppression and helping people who need it and who are being totally objectified and commoditized by their own bosses and by their own companies, the people who pay their paychecks. And they're the useful idiots of the executives, and they don't realize it. The executives realize it. They don't. And this is the ethos that governs our media and our corporate culture in the United States, and that's the broader relevance of all of this. Of course, the media is not going to care as much about Hunter Biden as it would have Ivanka or Don Jr. Of course, we all know that. But the broader relevance of the story is that the ethos that governs our corporations in this company is completely morally bankrupt and in enormously counterproductive ways.
I couldn't agree more. These kind of campaigns give a pass to the executives, as you say, and give a pass to the bad behavior of these organizations that should be brought into question in equal measure.
Colin, I'm looking forward to what's on your radar next.